Hey there, friend. Thanks sincerely for choosing to watch this video. It truly means a lot. If you hit that subscribe button, it'd make my day. Now let's jump right in. Matthew Callahan once believed he could control outcomes. He thought deadlines bent to discipline, conflicts could be reasoned into submission, and outcomes could always be shaped by sheer will. That confidence began to unravel the moment he stepped off the transport shuttle at Grand Coast Resort. Palm trees lined the entryway, parting like stage curtains as if welcoming him into a different reality. The breeze carried hints of salt and citrus. Julia, his wife of 8 years, danced through the sunlight, her phone aloft as she captured wide, dreamy shots, as though chasing some unseen magic. But Matthew wasn't chasing anything anymore. He was retreating. The vacation had been Julia's suggestion, a last-ditch effort to reconnect. He'd agreed, not out of excitement, but exhaustion. Truthfully, he no longer recognized what reconnection even meant. Somewhere between endless boardroom presentations and forgotten anniversaries, the language of closeness had faded. While he quietly filled out registration paperwork at the check-in desk, Julia meandered through the lobby, marveling at its ambience. She admired the chandelier, commented on the soft music in the air. Her voice still carried that melodic rise he used to adore, but now, hearing her felt like listening to a familiar song from a life that wasn't his anymore. That night they dined beneath hanging lanterns with butter-poached lobster on their plates and chilled wine sweating in silver buckets. It should have been romantic. Yet Julia's eyes wandered, not toward him, but across the room, as if awaiting someone else's arrival. Matthew tried not to fixate, until Brian entered the picture. Bronze-skinned, athletic, with eyes like carved obsidian. Brian Dalton, the resort's scuba instructor, had a charisma that seemed effortless. He spoke with smooth sincerity, his compliments warm and easy. And Julia glowed beneath them in a way Matthew hadn't seen in years, perhaps longer than he wanted to admit. When Brian leaned in to suggest a sunrise dive, Julia laughed. The sound struck Matthew like the snap of a fault line. The next morning, wrapped in a towel, she waved a brochure at him. "Want to come?" she asked, eyes sparkling. He declined. Volleyball with strangers felt less threatening. That, perhaps, is when the real break began. Not just in their plans, but in the underlying story of their relationship. By midday, flushed from the game and basking in small-talk victories, Matthew returned to the suite. It was empty. Julia's towel lay draped over a chair. Her phone sat charging. A note on the table read, "Went diving. Back by lunch. Love you." Noon passed. 1 o'clock. Then 2. The dive boat finally crept into view at 2 p.m. From the shoreline, Matthew saw her laughing as she stepped off, alone with Brian. No dive group, no crew in sight, just the two of them. The room felt cavernous when he returned. He didn't yell. Instead, he asked calm, pointed questions. Where had she gone? Why hadn't she reached out? Julia claimed the boat had issues. They'd been stranded. Nothing more. But her voice wavered, and she couldn't hold his gaze. Whatever invisible wall had lingered between them was now a barrier as thick and real as concrete. When he asked for the truth one last time, she deflected. That evening, Matthew knocked on the office door of Samuel, the resort's manager, and an old college friend, and requested access to the boat's camera logs. He wasn't seeking vengeance, just the truth. What he found was worse than assumption. The footage, grainy but unmistakable, showed Julia and Brian kissing under the early sun. Not a brief peck, a kiss heavy with meaning. Later, the two reclined on the sand, laughing, his fingers gently brushing sand from her shoulder. A moment dressed up as leisure, but clearly betrayal. Matthew watched in silence. Samuel offered to terminate Brian immediately. Matthew gave a slow nod, but the gesture felt hollow. He returned to their suite and placed the USB drive in Julia's hand. She crumpled into tears, apologizing over and over, calling it a mistake, one moment of weakness. Matthew believed she was sincere, but sincerity didn't undo the damage. Forgiveness never came. By sunrise, their bags were packed. By sunset, the marriage was over in every way that counted. The flight back to New York was a graveyard of silence. Julia wept beside him, whispering apologies between quiet sobs. Matthew stared ahead, his mind playing memories like film. The night they danced in the kitchen barefoot, their spontaneous Vancouver trip, how she hummed while shampooing her hair. Now, those recollections felt like someone else's life. As the plane descended, he was certain. There would be no conversations, no second chances. The bond hadn't fractured, it had vanished. At the apartment, Julia made a final plea. "Please don't let it end like this," she said. "I know I hurt you, but we've built so much. Don't throw it away." Matthew didn't respond with anger. He didn't raise his voice. He walked quietly past the framed memories lining the wall. Dinner in Napa, a golden sunset over Boston. Louis, their late dog, now buried beneath a maple tree behind his parents' home. One by one, he turned the frames face down. Then, in a voice steady and cold, he said, "Be out by Friday." Julia didn't protest. Her packing was quiet. Her crying had turned low and hollow. When she left, the skies held no storm, but the clouds hung like slate, muted and still. Outside, Rebecca was waiting, Matthew's lifelong friend. The one Julia never trusted, sensing something unspoken between them. Rebecca stepped from her car, gave him a brief nod. No words, just quiet understanding. Julia paused before getting in. Her eyes swept the apartment as though trying to lock the details into memory. Matthew didn't look back. That evening, the city's glow casting patterns on his ceiling, he sat at his desk and attached the video clip to an email addressed to a divorce attorney. The subject line read, "Marital breach, evidence attached." Everything moved quickly after that. His attorney replied the same evening. Though the state didn't observe fault-based divorce, the footage, its timing, its content, gave Matthew considerable leverage, and he planned to use it. While his lawyer worked swiftly, Julia's team delayed, perhaps hoping time would erode his resolve. It didn't. He approached mediation as he did business, composed, strategic, emotionally absent. Her lawyers painted the affair as a product of stress, a lapse in emotional stability. They even hinted that Brian had manipulated her. But the footage, blurry as it was, shattered every defense. There was no faking the way she returned his kiss, or how she burst into laughter right after. The judge, though not without heart, remained unmoved. Mercy wasn't extended. The evidence told a blunt story. Disloyalty, plain and unvarnished. The video had erased all ambiguity. Julia's request for an equitable division of assets was denied. Matthew walked away with the condo, the bulk of their savings, and their carefully curated investment portfolio. Julia was left with her car and a modest balance in her checking account. No alimony, no recourse. The damage was irreversible. Still, victory brought Matthew no solace. The judgment offered no peace. Sleep continued to evade him. The bed remained a void. He quit drinking and took up running instead. Each pre-dawn run became a ritual, pounding the streets until his lungs gave out, until the wind's bite drove away her memory, if only for a moment. Afterward, he'd shower, sit at his desk, and write. First came flashes of fiction. Then came personal essays. Eventually, a novel emerged, thinly disguised, but unmistakably rooted in his own experience. With every sentence, something uncoiled. Pain was shaped, contained, but never allowed to consume. Julia, meanwhile, found temporary sanctuary with Rebecca, an irony, given how little she'd liked her. But Rebecca, ever loyal, offered her a bed and a safe place to unravel. Occasionally, Julia sent him messages. Long, aching confessions steeped in regret. He read every one. He never replied. In one of them, she mentioned that Brian had reached out to apologize. "I deleted it," she wrote. "He didn't deserve even that much." Matthew lingered on that line, not out of belief, but because it didn't matter either way. Forgiving wasn't the same as forgetting, and forgetting was out of the question, especially the image of that boat gliding into view, her laughter rising as she leaned into someone else's arms. That laugh had once belonged to him. Eventually, he started therapy, not seeking repair but understanding. His therapist was direct. "You're not angry because she cheated," she said. "You're angry because she replaced you so easily, because she made you feel disposable." He didn't protest. The truth lodged itself deep and stayed there. As for revenge, it had only just begun. By the third month, Matthew had transformed. His body was leaner, his manner quieter, his decisions sharper. His home turned into a study in minimalism. Every trace of her was systematically removed. The vanilla candles, the decorative pillows she insisted on, her favorite chipped mug, all of it packed away and discarded, except for one item. A flash drive stored precisely on a shelf in his study, not for sentiment, but as a matter of principle. It was the fulcrum of everything. Even with the court's ruling in his favor, something still felt unresolved. The broader world didn't know the full story. His parents had only fragments. Her social circle still posted curated snapshots of her smiling beneath hashtags like "she healing journey." Rumors lingered. Some even thought he'd driven her away, that her infidelity was a slip, not a choice. Matthew didn't want melodramatic revenge. He didn't want her in pain. What he wanted was clarity, precision. And then, like fate casually extending its hand, an email arrived. A past client, now a senior executive at a high-end resort group, invited him to pitch a consulting strategy. The location? Grand Coast Resort. The place where it had all come undone. Matthew accepted without hesitation. He finalized the proposal and boarded the plane solo. This time, the surf didn't provoke anything. The salt air didn't sting. He arrived like a scalpel, calm, controlled. On the second day of meetings, during a discussion on employee compliance, he suggested an idea. He called it a system of integrity audits, anonymous footage reviews, logs of activity, internal behavioral ratings. Some in the room raised eyebrows. The CEO leaned in. "You mean monitoring behind-the-scenes behavior?" Matthew gave a single steady nod. "You'd be surprised by what surfaces." No names were exchanged. But in follow-up sessions, he handed over a redacted version of the original footage. Just enough to expose a breach. Just enough to warrant policy change. The leadership team was impressed. Policies were overhauled. Staff retraining commenced. And without fanfare or fallout, Brian Dalton's name vanished from all affiliated properties. No public firing, no statement. Just a string of locked doors. Matthew didn't smile. But that night, he slept through till morning, for the first time in weeks. Back home, Julia reached out and asked to meet. He agreed. 1 hour, neutral ground. She wore a blouse he vaguely recognized, perhaps from a distant Thanksgiving dinner. Her voice was softer, her words chosen carefully. "I'm working now," she said. "Remote marketing, taking online classes too." Matthew nodded without expression. "I still think about us," she added. He took a sip from his coffee. "You think about what you lost," he replied. "You gave it up. For what? Curiosity? A thrill?" Her eyes dropped to the table. "I didn't know how lost I was until there was no way back." He set his cup down. "That doesn't change what happened." "I know," she whispered. "I'm not here for forgiveness, just to leave things less tangled than before." "You left already," he said. "That day. On that boat. With that kiss." A long silence followed. Before leaving, she passed him a folded letter, handwritten, full of apologies and hesitant hope. He read it that evening, then fed it to the fire. Time moved on. Seasons shifted. Life regained definition, if not familiarity. He began spending more time with Rebecca. They hiked together. Sometimes they just sat, looking out at the distant glow of the city. One quiet afternoon she spoke. "You didn't just survive it," she said. "You built something better out of it." Matthew didn't respond right away, but he looked at her for a long time. Was it true? The hurt hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape. Winter gave way to spring. The days lengthened, and life continued, not in spite of the past, but beyond it. At work, he became a figure of precision, steady under pressure. Colleagues respected his judgment, never suspecting it had been tempered in betrayal's furnace. Then, nearly a year after everything had collapsed, a message arrived, unforeseen, from Brian. It came through a professional networking site. Brief, cautious. "I owe you more than an apology. I'm sober now. Therapy's helped. If you ever want clarity, I'm available. No defenses. Just truth." Matthew sat there staring at the screen, fingers twitching slightly. It wasn't anger that rose. It was curiosity. What had he truly expected? To reverse it all? To rewind the consequences, perhaps? He never said. But the message awakened something long buried, a silent ache he thought had faded. It pulled up a question he believed he'd buried for good. Had Julia really cut Brian out of her life? He had never snooped through her phone. Beyond that single USB drive, he hadn't dug. Yet the possibility lingered in his mind like a splinter. Eventually, he gave in to it. He contacted a professional, a cyber investigator. The process was careful, clean, within the bounds of privacy and legality. The request was simple. Look for any remaining online traces between Julia and Brian. Public interactions, legal records, unencrypted communications, no hacking, just answers. 2 weeks later, a report arrived in his inbox. There was no bombshell, but there was something. A flicker in the ashes. 3 months after the diving trip, well after Julia had vowed it was over, she'd messaged Brian on a private app. "I chose this. You're not to blame. One day I hope the one I hurt can forgive me." She wasn't writing to Brian when she said that. She meant Matthew. But she never mentioned that message to him. That small omission shifted everything. It wasn't just betrayal. It was concealment. She had chosen to protect the man who helped fracture their vows, instead of the man to whom those vows were made. It had never been just about the kiss, the trip, or the footage. It was about trust, the kind meant to outlast the damage. Matthew never confronted her. There was no purpose. The divorce was finalized. The ink had dried. Assets divided. But truth doesn't always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it rewrites the past in silence. From then on, her apologies felt scripted. Matthew stopped playing the part of the passive, grieving ex. He redirected the ruin into his writing. His work grew sharper, more fearless. He began submitting under a pseudonym. One story, The Coral Lie, went viral, praised for its raw, poetic portrait of a husband left behind both literally and emotionally. Everyone assumed it was fiction. It wasn't. Inquiries followed. Agents reached out. Indie publishers showed interest. Within 6 months, a small literary press picked up his debut collection. At the launch, in a quiet bookshop filled with strangers, he read aloud pages woven with betrayal, sorrow, and restraint. When he looked up from the final stanza, he saw faces held in quiet awe. And near the back, Julia. She didn't come forward, didn't signal him, but her tear-filled eyes said what words could not. She slipped out before he could finish. That was the closure he hadn't known he needed. Later, on the rooftop of his apartment, the wind tugging at his coat sleeves, Rebecca arrived carrying 2 steaming mugs. "She was there," she said softly. He gave a small nod. "I saw. You okay?" He took a breath, long and deep. "Yeah." I think I finally am. Because he understood now, revenge wasn't about legal outcomes, career fallout, or emotional distance. It was about change, becoming someone whose identity no longer circled around what had been lost. Autumn returned, marking a year since the final court date. But this time, the crisp air didn't sting. It cleared. He walked those courthouse steps not for litigation, but to read at a regional author event. A local journalist had featured him with the headline, "From Shattered to Structure, the Anonymous Author Who Turned Pain into Pages." But he wasn't anonymous anymore. The name he'd written under had grown into a public self. Readers guessed. Eventually, Matthew stepped into the light, and though the world came to know his story, not once did he speak her name. Julia had since moved to a quiet suburb outside the city. She worked as a digital strategist for a boutique firm. Friends mentioned she kept a low profile, rarely socialized. The spark she once carried seemed dulled, held in. Then one day she sent one last message. "I read it all, every word. I saw who I was in those pages. And I saw you, the man you were, the man you've become. I'm not asking for anything. Just know I never stopped loving you, even when I didn't know how to show it." He didn't respond. There was no need. He had come to understand love isn't proven by words. It's revealed in action. Months later, at a literary gala, Matthew's book was honored with a nonfiction award. He took the stage and his speech was short but unflinching. Sometimes those we trust most are the ones who leave the deepest lessons. Betrayal doesn't have to destroy you. It can shape who you're meant to become. Thank you for recognizing not the wound, but what emerged from it. The applause came gently, like a soft fire in the dark. That night, walking through streets bathed in lamplight, he returned home to find Rebecca waiting on his stoop, 2 cups of warm cider in her hands. She handed him one. "You won," she said. "The prize?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "The battle." They sat quietly, shoulders touching, leaning into the cool stone ledge. Above them, the stars blinked in the hush of the night. And for the first time in years, Matthew didn't feel the ache of what was lost. He felt complete. Not patched up, not guarded, just whole. He never erased Julia from his story. He made peace with her memory, like an old scar, no longer something he had to hide from his own reflection. And so, this chapter ends. Share your thoughts below if you'd like. Thank you for walking this road with the story. If it moved you, there are more waiting. Until we meet again, dear reader.